Charlie Valentine pulled 3 nights' worth from his veins, then plugged the needle into the throbbing muscle of the register. The scalped motel owner watched the colors swirl from black to a very faint navy blue. He hesitated, a scowl tugging the grafted replacements that took up where his hair had been. Charlie tried to entertain himself by imagining the color and style his half-formed melon may have had. It took away a little of the tension that he felt from the man's critical gazing of his blood that, if not for the quantity, would have been worthless. Obviously, the owner's thoughts flowed through the same stream as he lowered his hands to the keyboard and began to 2-finger type. "I'll give you 2 nights," the owner said in frustration. Perhaps it was out of the goodness of his heart, business being slow, or just being too lazy to perform a refund. But whatever it was, Charlie was relieved. He hoped for at least 1 night to get the edge off. 2 may be enough to come up with a plan. The Latchers were off his scent for now, and with Charlie pumping so much pollution into his veins, his taste would be difficult to recognize. But they wanted him, and badly. The owner finished his monotonous plinking away at the keyboard, and the vase-shaped muscle twitched, then swallowed Charlie's payment, finishing with a final spasm that seemed more of a gag. Beggars can't be choosers, he thought to himself. He held the statement in his subconscious like a billboard as he took the bone-chiseled key from the owner. 19, the man murmured, then returned to the television embedded within the flesh of his wall, forgetting Charlie altogether. Likewise, Charlie turned and hobbled out into the parking lot as he lit up a cigarette, trying to kill the stink of the place. The muscle and bone that made up the foundation was barely preserved. The teeth lining each window sill and doorway had blackened. The skin roof had shriveled so much from the desert heat that a greenish rotting cancer had begun to fester from the breaks which had cracked open. Apart from a faint, rot-carrying breeze into Charlie's ears, it was quiet. No cars rumbled down the highway. Nothing for anyone to see, except for the ones already seeing it. Nothing worth 12 ounces of blood, which Charlie finally began to feel the effects of. He shuffled over to the rusty Pinto, poked the trunk, and grabbed his deflated balloon of a travel bag, then pierced the football-shaped cyst that held the still-fresh kidney. He shut the trunk before the smell could escape and cause him to vomit. That was something he could not handle right now. He was feeling very dizzy, and he needed to lie down desperately. Needed to sleep, though he wondered if he could, and what good it would do. If he slept tonight, he would just bring on tomorrow even quicker. He thought of the gun as he hobbled painfully past each door. It may be a consideration sooner than he intended. The stump where his foot had been severed was bleeding. He was in no shape to run anymore. Perhaps this would be a fitting place for him to end his pursuit. After all, he'd had a good chase, hadn't he? Bloodying the noses of the processors enough for their retribution. 2 Latchers died by his switchblade, their screams still echoing deliciously in his memory. Though one of the screams was in his own voice, and Ruby Brennan's eyes of dazzling silver gazed up at him as he rained down blow after blow. The attention was away from her, at least. That was all that had mattered. She'd be safe, as long as the Latchers kept after Charlie. So the gun option was out, until he knew for sure that he was to be processed, as he had nothing more that the Latchers would want to take for themselves. Sleep needed to be his plan. He sighed warily as he reached for the door. The ivory felt hollow in his hands, cheap. No doubt someone behind on their debt, like Ruby's parents. Members of a mindless and mangled workforce, hoping to spare their beautiful baby girl their hardships. Until, of course, they had nothing left to give. At least, nothing that they could spare, and continue to keep on grinding for work. So the key could very well have come from the unfortunate loved one of a debtor. Charlie unlocked the door and stumbled inside, the block replacing his foot, thumping into the doorway. kicking some black teeth across the floor. He flipped on the light long enough to see that the room was what he expected. Basic bed with a mattress of fat, hair-stuffed pillows, TV mounted atop a cartilage and sinew forged table, toilet and sink made of cheaply polished bone. He locked the door and flipped off the lights, dropping his bag and collapsing face first onto the bed. It sloshed back and forth for a few moments with the impact, then became still. From the wall, he heard an argument to his left and lovemaking to his right. He rolled over on his back and whistled a melancholy tune, one he'd written a long time ago, it seemed. The lyrics were sung from his memories, back before his voice had been stolen. He reached up and touched his throat where the veins of the latcher had burrowed and pulled out his vocal cords, then spewed out the rubbery muck that seared shut their replacements. He didn't think anything could hurt so bad. That is, until he saw the latchers later that day, one singing with his voice, the other one looking at him with Ruby's eyes. They lied as they died. That was enough comfort for him as far as the end of the ordeal went. But to imagine tears flowing from black, lifeless spheres of Ruby's eye sockets were something that Charlie could not man up and face. He fled the scene as a hoodlum and a murderer. Such was life. A fly landed beneath his right eye, crawling down his lips. Charlie didn't bother swatting it away. He felt a couple more hover over his stump, landing and surveying at their potential meal. A place to eat and breathe safely, away from the harshness of the desert. They were no different than him. Charlie felt as though there would be bad karma for him if he were to deny these tiny scavengers safety and comfort when he himself longed for it as well. Just as he thought of this, however, the explosion of the Pinto lit up the room and shattered the glass. Charlie jolted upright, tiny shards falling from him and tinkling on the floor. They were here. How long had he been lying down? Did they just miss him entering the room? Was it really them, or did somebody even more desperate than he try to steal the vehicle? If so, there was an example of karma, which he feared a few seconds ago. He grabbed the bag from the floor without a thought of specks of glass cutting his hands. He unzipped it and reached inside for the gun, feeling the skin that had once been his heel, now manufactured into a grip. In the light, Charlie could see the intricate workings that the bone of his foot had made. A sloppily made barrel that was an amalgamation of his toes melded and tacked together in a straight line. Along the side were mishmashes of nail and muscle, forming the shape of a mock firearm, with skin covering the grip and hammer. Charlie chambered the first 5 rounds with little confidence. Marlowe promised an untraceable and dependable weapon, for its allotted rounds at least, but Charlie couldn't shake the doubt he felt. All things would be revealed shortly. The closed blinds, which were surprisingly intact, were subtly carried upward by the breeze outside. Through its movement, Charlie could catch glimpses of his flaming car. He approached the window and saw 2 jet-black sedans pulled up on each side, their glass blown out and blood visible on their hoods. There was a sound of scrambling and panting, along with the fresh dust being stirred up from the earth. Charlie looked downward, and he could see that one of them was writhing about in agony. It had opened up to reveal its collection of eyes, tongues, hair, organs, and blood. So much blood. 3, Charlie whispered to himself, with a harsh gravel that filled him with even more hatred upon hearing it. He reached over and slowly unlocked the door. Within the 2 adjoining rooms, the argument and the lovemaking had ceased, replaced by worried mumbles and whimpering. If they were also seeing what was outside, they had no doubt been more frightened by the 2 black cars and the dying latchers than the explosion. However, their quiet murmurs turned to screams as Charlie heard their doors bursting open. He missed their approach to the nearby room, and his. The door broke off its hinges and a latcher stepped inside. It was in the form of a man, long black hair, wide green eyes, dirt and blood speckling across the agitated face. It stepped past Charlie for a moment, not seeing him to its right, but noticed him quickly as he attempted to aim at its head. The latcher shrilled and caught his arm, which held the weapon. Already the burrowing began in his wrist. Charlie grabbed its throat and struck it in the mockery of a face with his forehead as hard as he could. The latcher turned loose, but its veins were still holding inside his wrist. He grabbed the tendrils and began pulling them out from his flesh when the latcher slammed its open palm beneath Charlie's chin and began to strangle him. The day he begged for his voice to be taken instead of Ruby's eyes. He knew if he could just endure the agony, no matter how long it lasted, she'd be all right. She wasn't, though. Now the pain was beginning again as this latcher began to pierce its way into his flesh. Charlie defiantly ripped free from his wrist, placing the gun in the creature's chest and pulling the trigger. His ears went immediately deaf, and the explosion that had come from what had once been his foot nearly blinded him as well. The veins left his throat, and a large hole sloshed its red muck on the floor. As with the latcher outside, stolen bits of endless victims began pouring out and wiggling around in the open air. Despite the muted sound, Charlie still made out its scream amongst the visceral carnage. 4, he shouted as he cocked another round into the chamber. Charlie no longer felt the doubt in his weapon. Instead, he readied it towards the doorway, and as if in answer to his instincts, another latcher stepped inside. Not having time for the stolen eyes to adjust to the darkness, it never saw the one it was searching for, only a sudden flash that seemed more akin to a bolt of lightning. The explosion of its head sent Charlie into a maniacal joy. He only wished that Ruby could see this chaos that he had created, smell the sweet stink of their filth tainting the air with their abominations. It was enough to install a small mouthful of vomit, but Charlie didn't allow the revulsion to hinder his enjoyment. He simply let the word 5 follow the bile from his lips. There was at least one more. Likely it was in the room to his left, seeing how the others came through the door at more of a right angle. But Charlie couldn't be certain. He thought for a moment that he might wait for another to walk through the door, but its still writhing comrade had fallen outside into the light of day. No doubt it knew by now where he was, and that he was armed. Charlie waited for his hearing to hopefully come back. His wrist began to hurt badly from the oozing wound, and the surprising intensity from the gun recoil. As much as he felt victorious so far, the pain was a reminder of just how limited his time was. Again he questioned himself what the whole point was to this resistance. They may leave Ruby and her family alone for now, but who's to say they wouldn't tie everything back to them? They would require whatever their demented justice demanded, and she would be the one to pay the price. It wasn't only her eyes that held value. All that had initially captured his heart now only added more sorrow. Every element of Ruby would be taken. She would be mangled, a husk, like her own parents, in just a matter of months, unless she found a better means of success in life, besides being the prettiest EMT in Ellisboro. Only those who have plenty to give can keep what they have, yet beneath even the most successful life, the latchers wait for their failure so that they can take the pieces they desire. There was nothing for it. He stepped over the carcass he had made and into the sun, which was now pleasantly warm compared to the room. The flames of the earlier explosion were beginning to die. His hearing returned fully, and he could now hear the whimpering of his neighbors, the lovers, as the rumbling growl of the last latcher seeped out their broken door. Charlie approached painfully as his stump began to itch, There was the shape of a woman in the corner of the room, and the closer he got, the more Charlie could see that the latcher had a hold of her. He limped inside, keeping his eyes on what was soon to be number 6. Suddenly, though, just like the one that broke into his room, he was surprised from the right and thrown to the ground. He made a stupid mistake, and now everything had come to a sudden end. The latcher that surprised him placed his foot atop his spine and pressed down viciously. It was over. The couple was allowed to leave now that they had what they wanted. They spoke to him about the processors and how he was destined for pain before death, but he tuned them out. It didn't matter what they said. It all summed up with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. He deserved what had happened to him, but as long as Ruby, 2 shots erupted. Charlie initially believed that they had decided to kill him with his own weapon, discovering otherwise when the shrieks and the smell filled the room. A hand gently turned him over, and Charlie Valentine felt the pure crystal drops that fell from Ruby's black eyes. "10, 20, 30, 40. It wasn't fast enough. Ruby Brennan let her instincts as a paramedic take the wheel of the Latcher's sedan. It was the least damage from the explosion of Charlie's car, yet all the glass had been blown out, and she could feel delicate cuts from the tiny remains. She had to ignore it, had to keep herself focused. She had her patient. Now she just had to get to safety. 50, 60, 70. Still not fast enough. Never fast enough. The wheel of skin began to quake in Ruby's grip. Somehow, through her panic, she caught herself rubbing the small peach hairs of the wheel. Charlie lay unconscious in the passenger seat, his body reeking of blood and rot. She had to quit thinking about him. She couldn't stop now to tend to him. Its shape was growing larger in the rearview mirror. 80, 90. The torrent of rain, rushing in through the shattered windshield, brought the wafting heat of summer, despite the dark billows that brought a premature night. The rain would wake Charlie up. He'd be in pain, and she couldn't help him much without any real sort of medical equipment. 100, 110, 120, 125, 123. A bolt of lightning, the silhouette of the thing in the distance. Not fast enough, never fast enough. The engine seemed to hold back on its efforts, seeing how its former masters had been dealt with. She focused her eyes to the empty desert road, then to the dash. The tank was going on a quarter of blood. Between the two of them, they may have been able to get it up to half, if it weren't for Charlie's stupidity and the thing running them down. It has multiple heads. She didn't dare look. 122, 124, 123. Please, please, please. Kick him out. The smoker with Caesar's face was lounged in the back seat. Zoot suit, fat cigar of shadow, his exhalations releasing clouds of second-hand panic. "Ellisboro is 20 miles from here." "I told you before, shut up," Ruby shouted, turning her head slightly to see a mockery of Caesar's playful smirk began to form as it took in another draw. "You 'member your mother's eyes, Ruby. 'Member how she'd kiss the scuffs and marks you'd get from playing out in the street? Yeah, you do. She can't do that no more, can she?" Ruby felt the tears seep from where her mother's eyes had set before. She now had Mama's eyes again. Step 1. The smoke was thick now, choking her with its fumigation, despite all the glass being shattered and the violent air passing through the car. The smoker's words were perfectly audible, despite the roar of the engine and the deafening wind in her ears. "Look in the mirror, sweet thing. So much more to lose. But watch that right turn ahead." Ruby was aware of it, the car screeching, burnt rubber faintly mingling in with the stink of Charlie's dead weight. His seatbelt wasn't on, yet somehow he remained fairly stationary during the turn, only his head lolling about, like a corpse. "That's right, sweetheart, he's dead. And even if he isn't, he will be soon. Say by some miracle you make it. Will anyone help you with the render after you?" Another bolt of lightning illuminated the darkness, as if in dramatic response to the lines of the smoker's performance. Ruby fought the urge to look and see the thing's progress. Instead, she tried to glance at the dash once more. The low traction light was on. She shuddered at the hopelessness of her childish nightmares, all coming true. "Yeah, baby, that's what it is, a render. In fact, the first time you heard that they were coming for your daddy's tongue, you believed it was one of them who'd do the job. You cried for hours. You made your mama hysterical. Your parents' lives were caving in on them, and all you could think about were those terrifying stories your friends told you. Friends like him." Ruby could picture a grotesque finger pointing at Charlie. He was right. Charlie told her all those frightening stories of the ones that tore those who fled the law to shreds. Frankie and Caesar would beg to hear them. She would too, she guessed. She remembered Kat being too afraid and leaving whenever he would start telling them. They'd laugh at her. Ruby now wished that she had followed her. "Ruby!" The stink of his breath was in her ear, a cloud filling her vision as the words released. Fresh tears from the sting of the smoke, or the truth they spoke. "They're real. There is one behind you now, girl. Getting closer. When it sees your face, they'll all know who you are, and they'll always come after you." The figure sat back and relinquished his cigar. That smirk, now a dark yellow grin. "And it's all his fault." A shower began to fall. Cold. Would have been refreshing on any other day, save for the consistent lightning. Just as Ruby predicted, Charlie began to stir. He raised his head and winced in pain, then held up his hand to block the rain pouring in. Ruby felt hatred for him. Such a stupid man, going out of his way to throw even more guilt on her. Despite the warped fratricide her mind had conjured up, Caesar was the one she had loved, and Charlie knew it. Yet, he'd constantly written songs about her, poetry, spoken in smoky bars, even got some blood for his trouble, had a chance for even more, but he turned it down. He didn't want to leave Ellisboro. "It's home," he said. She knew the reason, just like she knew the meaning of his songs. "Silver linings, when you sway, waltzing Rebecca, checking my rear view mirror." She stopped herself, kept her eyes forward, more turned ahead. The tires screeched, along with something else, something close. She looked at Charlie, seeing his haggard, idiotic visage staring at her through the mists and flashes of the storm. Confused, stupid, he was about to say her name when a sudden impact smashed the back of the car. It wasn't enough to make them swerve, but it was enough to make Ruby realize just how out of time she was. If she was going to give him up, it was now or never. "My gun," Charlie mumbled. She practically saw his look of terror in the corner of her eye. "Where's the gun?" Ruby didn't answer. More turns, more screeches. She had it in her coat pocket. No doubt it was the actual source of the stench that she had been suffering through. It had 5 shots. That meant only one remained. She had hoped for more, but was relieved to know that there was at least one left. She remembered seeing the explosion as she neared the motel on her motorcycle. Then, after she stopped, she heard 2 shots ring out. It was a war zone. The Latchers screamed, and she thought she heard Charlie's mangled voice shouting something. She'd finally found him, but was it really worth getting involved now? "You should have kept on, Ruby." The smoker began again, a raspy machine gun laugh filling her mind. Should have turned on the top 20 and headed west. But you didn't, did you? Nah, you had to check on Chuck. Had to make sure he was okay. He wasn't. He was gonna reap what he sowed. But you had to help him, didn't you? How do you think I feel that it was just 3 short weeks before you'd leave town, like I'd been begging you to? And you did it for Charlie Valentine, not me. Now you two lovebirds are gonna get ripped apart together. Your screams are gonna get drowned out in the rain. You might make a couple of nice ashtrays, or faucets, or rooftops, or maybe a rear view mirror. Ruby suddenly saw her 2 ink-black spheres encased within her soaked brows, but past her reflection, clinging to the back of the vehicle, the render was stooping its 3 heads through the window frame. The smoker was now sitting comfortably with his legs crossed. The stub of his cigar brightened from its final draw. "Make it right, baby," he said, flicking the butt away without taking his eyes off of Ruby. "Charlie?" He didn't look at her. Instead, he began to rise from the seat and make his way to the back. "Charlie!" His head shuddered in agony. Ruby saw his hand fall upon broken glass left behind in the console. She remembered a knock at her door 3 weeks ago. Charlie's sad face as he said without greeting, "There's broken glass. Put your shoes on and come in." He was always looking out for her, always worried, always caring. The alley was where Caesar hid the ring he had made from some molars. Charlie was the only one who told her where he hid it. Charlie was the only one of Caesar's friends that he trusted, unwavering in all things. Another would greet her at the door a few days later, with Charlie's beautiful voice, but not his face. "Charlie!" Ruby screamed as she forced him back down. "Seatbelt!" The heads were breathing in her ear like the smoker, only these were real, and she could do something about them. She grabbed hold of the emergency brake, pulled, and felt the writhing limbs crush past her face as the render was ejected from the front of the car. The screech of tires once more mingled with the sound of the abomination, and to Ruby's great satisfaction, its cries surpassed their frequency. The car overtook the render, and the grating of its body between the concrete and the weight and the speed of the vehicle made Ruby grit her teeth in defiance. However, the creature began to resist, and through the combination of its spasms and inertia, the car suddenly turned clockwise and began to flip. Ruby's existence became a storm of metal, skin, hair, and loose glass. The rotations seemed to increase in speed the more she wished for an end. Her thoughts were a void of uncohesive ponderings throughout the chase. Mother's eyes, Daddy's lectures, victims she'd have given up on and allowed for the processors to take. Charlie's songs, Caesar holding her while the sun set, giving another spiel about his plans. "We're gonna get out of here, baby. We're gonna head north in spring, and by then I'll have enough plas to get us to a nice place, away from the grind plants. You can be the sexiest surgeon in whatever town we choose. Hell, I'll polish bone for new Chrysler models when I'm not mooching off your looks and the plas you bring in. Just gotta hang in there, baby. Keep those eyes on the future. I ain't gonna end up like my folks, and I know you don't want that either." Ruby felt Caesar's hands fall away, and a cold, wet grip on her wrist as she was being pulled painfully out of the vehicle. Her eyes were blinded by a flame in the darkness that raged from the engine. "Ruby! Ruby, wake up!" Charlie's voice seemed far away, though she knew he was right there. Pulling her from the wreckage, always worried, always caring, always... She looked back to the car and saw that he was upside down, struggling to free himself from the seatbelt as the flames rose. Ruby looked up to see 3 eyes from 2 different heads looking down at her. She screamed and began to thrash herself, but the render held her with pure malice in its grip. Many of its jumble of arms and legs were either partially or fully broken. One of its 3 heads swung about lifelessly, and as the creature pulled Ruby along, it left a large, thick trail of blood and bile. If Ruby was seriously injured, she didn't know about it yet. At that moment, right now, she was only aware of the realization and the hopelessness of her situation. Charlie was going to burn to death, and she was being pulled into one of her childhood nightmares. As she fought, she felt the weight of the gun swing beneath her from the pocket of her open coat. If she could just get it. Charlie began to scream. Ruby's heart sank. She tried to look in his direction, but the abomination suddenly tossed her down to the dirt. Ruby had landed on the gun, which thankfully hadn't discharged, but as she reached around to grab it, one of the limbs had her throat. The dead parts had begun to suddenly fall off the render, and Ruby realized what was about to happen once the blades emerged from its mangled form. She struggled for the gun. It was all she had left. She couldn't save Charlie, couldn't go back home and make amends with her folks for leaving. Charlie's songs were pointless. Caesar's foolish plans were simply that, foolish. Such was the hope that any of them had. The features seemed to become more visible in the creature's face. Their still working eyes aligned with anticipation, and their mouths formed a grin. The more details the growing light gave, the more Ruby desperately fumbled for the only relief that she could fathom. It was the fulcrum of madness that invoked a scream, loud, echoing, the sounds of either triumph or hatred that Ruby thought had come from the render. She found out otherwise as the flaming form of Charlie collided with the creature, and the 2 of them tumbled to the ground. Without hesitation, Ruby picked herself up as best she could, momentarily noticing that her left foot was broken. She reached and pulled the gun from her pocket and nodded over to where Charlie struggled with the render. His body was steaming in the rain. She fell to her knees and shoved Charlie off the thing before it could start to dismember him, then placed the barrel against its heads and fired. The explosion of its filth covered Ruby, and the stink of it caused her to vomit. Its body wriggled comically, but after a few moments, the thing was dead. Ruby wanted to check on Charlie, but first she awkwardly dragged the render's wretched carcass over to the burning remains of the vehicle. When she'd returned to Charlie, he was face down, just as she had found him at the hotel. And once again, she was crying. The night was nearly upon them, and though the rain was letting up, they were in bad shape. Ruby collapsed on her right side next to him, gently pressing his arms, wanting to turn him over and see how badly he was hurt. Charlie complied with her wish and looked into her eyes. His eyebrows were singed. His face was caked with so much dirt and blood that it made Ruby start to laugh. They lay together in the dim light, the air very clear. Through a void of nothingness, Charlie could see a light in the distance, like a blue twinkling star. The soles of his feet felt no earth, yet his steps brought him closer and closer to it. There was no sound at first, not even his breathing, and he was breathing. How was he even walking without pain? What did it really matter? This empty dark was a relief compared to where he was going, even if he was laying next to Ruby, hearing her laugh. There was nothing now. No fear, no concern for himself or anything else. Nothing, and nothing, was better than what little something his life had amounted to. He was neither cold nor hot, comfortable or strained, calm or afraid. He was as much nothing as the world was around him. Yet that light was something. It was neither interesting nor mundane, lovely or abhorrent, but he kept moving towards it with a stride that seemed not entirely his will. Had he a will, he wouldn't know it. He was pointless, worthless, yet he and the distant light were the only two things existing on this plane. Why not continue on? Said a faint thought. Why not? Charlie agreed aloud. It's not like I have anything better to do. His voice wasn't his harsh, gravelly replacement, the one they had so graciously given him. What were they anyway? It didn't matter. Neither was his voice the one that he had sang with. Who was that again? It didn't matter either, he supposed. All voices heard here were no louder than thought, and they seemed to fade out of memory as though they had never been spoken. The light went from the size of a pin to a speck, to a dot, to a pupil of someone with silver eyes. There was something akin to a breeze, or the sensation of a breeze, or the idea of a breeze, he supposed. May have been the sound of water, a whisper, a taste of saliva in his mouth. The light was the size of a marble now, like what he'd used to play with Frankie at the end of Henpin Street. With that memory came a laugh. He was a boy, back against the wall of bones and mortar, cigarette in his mouth. The street was a beating heart. The cars were cells running to and fro, while he stood idle, waiting his turn to flick the black sphere into the crowd and scatter them abroad. He'd win this bet. He knew all the tricks. He would get that kiss from Ruby. The light was now a basketball, swishing through the net of tangled hair. Cheap. Ellisboro really had a lousy court. You would have thought that a town built around one of the most prominent processing plants in the country could afford a better goal. So cheap, yet the kids devotedly played every weekend. Sometimes the parents would watch, faceless, hairless forms, sitting quietly in the stands while Caesar kissed Ruby beneath the south side goal. Charlie sauntered over to her parents and sat in between them, their mangled arms embracing him around the shoulders. It's all right, kid. We understand. The light was now his mother's swollen belly, pregnant again. They had to pay their debt somehow. If only the Latchers were just a little more patient. Oh yeah, that's what they were called. With that thought, Charlie's next step landed in cold liquid. Clear, pure. He stopped and looked down to see a form writhing about beneath the ripples. He watched as the liquid calmed and he could see a young face. His face. What was he doing down there? He reached down towards himself, and likewise, his image reached up, and their hands clasped together in the cold pool. Charlie pulled his image, and it came up to meet him. "Thanks, man," the other Charlie said. His raspy words were loud and echoey, as if they came from the light. "Thought I'd never get out of there. Phew, my limbs are freezing, especially my foot." "About that," responded the dry Charlie, his words a faint, lovely whisper, an aspect of better things, or at least the idea of better things. Yeah, I know. You went and sliced it off. Hey, man, at least you put it to good use, right?" "Right," dry Charlie said, feeling saddened by the jest. It wasn't as though he wanted to do this to his counterpart, but what other choice did he have? Marlowe was a good guy. He knew how to fix someone up that was short on plaz. Wet Charlie was indeed low on plaz, Low on luck, low on cigarettes, low on love, full of heartache. About that, Wet Charlie croaked. Yeah, I know. Caesar was Ruby's man, not us. She was just an invitation to heartbreak, man. I'm sorry I dragged you into it. Don't mention it. It's just as much my fault as yours. More so mine. After all, I've got the wealth, not you. No offense, but that's not what I was gonna say. The light was now the size of a dartboard. Caesar's aim was off. A double followed by 2 off the board. I want to marry her, Charlie, mumbled Caesar through the pain of his pulled teeth, but she doesn't want to leave town. Charlie scoffed at his opponent's turn as he readied his own. Well, who would with you, he said, feeling bad for the response. He wondered if he was simply mocking his friend's lack of game or his predicament with Ruby's stubbornness. Either way, Caesar was out of luck. He'd be processed tomorrow. What were you gonna say? Asked Dry Charlie, now shivering from the ice water on his feet as they submerged in. The light was the size of the clock that was set in the bone archway of the bus station's entrance. The latchers were dead. Charlie, soaked in their filth, waited nervously for any bus out of Ellisboro. He blended in with those getting off their shift at the plant. That is, until he felt 2 arms curl around his side. It's all right, kid. We understand. No, they wouldn't have understood. How could Charlie have told them that Ruby's eyes were taken? That despite everything they had given to ensure otherwise, they had failed. They'd have to go home and watch their baby cry with those black marbles, knowing that it was all for nothing. He had to run. He had to steal a car and go. It was the best thing for Charlie, Ruby, and them when he was gone. The law would be after him, and they could get relief for a while, now that their debt collectors were out of the picture. Would there be more? Sure, but just a little relief is better than nothing at all. A little relief is something. I was gonna say that we are that little something, Charlie. The light was now a cloudless sky that hung above the 2 Charlies, who stood in the middle of a rippling mirror. Let me show you, rasped the Wet Charlie. There was the sound of a siren, red and blue lights, a street rushing by around him, an undulating form in the distance, now taking the place of the light, growing closer and closer, but not fast enough. Never fast enough. There were people sopping up the puddles of Caesar's blood, wringing it out into buckets, bottles, cans. They would want more. Ruby had to stop them. The ambulance roared as it sped towards the crowd. Janice, her partner, was screaming in her ears, trying to stop her. Ruby kept on, gnashing the inside of her mouth, tasting her own blood. The crowd disappeared only when it was nearly too late. Ruby heard screams all around her as she knelt down by the lifeless form of Caesar. She wanted to roll him on his back and begin chest palpitations, but she knew he was too broken to be moved by anything like that. She got up and ran to the back doors of the ambulance and began pulling out the stretcher, calling her partner to help her. Ruby could hear the crowd gathering around her, mumbling to themselves whether or not they should just rush the paramedics and take the Plaz that they had. Ruby called out for Janice again as the stretcher came crashing onto the pavement, but she never came around to help her. After a few minutes, Ruby rounded back where Caesar lay, only to find Janice herself filling up one of the collection bags for lost causes. The crowd also began to rush forward in a tumultuous cry of greed, and Ruby tried to run out in front of them, but was knocked aside. Her face busted against the concrete several times as the people trampled her. Those not close enough to Caesar stood around her, as well as on her. In her rage, Ruby reached up and began to bite down on the heel of a large man pressing down on her wrist. A sudden kick took her out of the world, though. It's amazing, Wet Charlie said. The little town she loves so much, Couldn't have cared less for her when it came down to it. Dry Charlie shook his head. They were desperate. True, but what made them that way? I didn't make this world, and I suppose you didn't either. Wet Charlie pulled a damp cigarette out of his pocket. Got a light? Dry Charlie pulled out a box of matches. Ain't gonna do you any good. Yeah, well, it's a thought that counts, am I right? No. Any thoughts of helping didn't save Caesar, said Dry Charlie, lighting a match. To Dry Charlie's surprise, Wet Charlie began to draw on a mouthful of nicotine, then blew out in his counterpart's face. And if you were there, would you have done more than think to help yourself to your old friend? Dry Charlie exhaled into his trembling hands. I hope I would have, but I wasn't there. You're right, snarled Wet Charlie through his teeth. You weren't there, but I was. Ruby slowly came into the back of the ambulance. The side of her face was wet where her tears had soaked the head of the stretcher. The doors were still open. Night had fallen. A voice hummed softly in her subconscious, and she felt strength in her limbs again. No one was there for her, not even Janice. She was alone in the night, yet there was no fear. There was nothing. Ruby felt a complete numbness as she exited the back of the ambulance and went to where she had found Caesar. The body was gone. Only little remnants of dried blood remained. She turned to go back to the ambulance and drove back to the hospital. She was told when she got there that the people had begun to get violent with one another over the corpse of Caesar, and that the Latchers were called in. Janice was dead, along with many of the crowd. Caesar's corpse had been taken to be processed, and no one was able to keep the blood. Ruby was numb to all of it. She felt neither anger nor sadness. She felt as though she were drifting through a dream, her feet feeling no earth, yet her steps carrying her somewhere. Wet Charlie was smirking to himself as the vision played out. They saw Ruby Brennan tell her parents about what had happened to Caesar, saw Charlie Valentine at her door, leading her to the ring that he had made, saw the Latchers at her door, there to take her eyes, claiming her parents' blood debt for Ruby's tuition was not being met, and they had nothing else to give. I know all of this, whispered Dry Charlie. You didn't see it. You ran away from it, Wet Charlie breathed in another draw, then exhaled a pure white cloud, followed by words in a voice as still as the trickle of blood. You need to see it, Charlie. It's my favorite part. Ruby lay in agony as the tears mingled with fresh blood seeping out of her sockets. It was the first pain that she had felt since Caesar's death. It all seemed to collide at once. She felt her heart break at the thought of her not being able to hold him again, kiss his lips, break his heart. She wasn't going to leave town with him. She had too much that she loved here. Her parents, her job, her school, her friends. She wanted to pay back everything she owed, not just run away from her obligations. The taking of her eyes was the beginning of that responsibility being met, and she could live with it. It was Charlie's voice being taken that she could not. He was always looking out for her, singing for her, writing songs about her. Now he was a criminal. Ruby heard his voice from one of the Latchers that came to collect her eyes, and she knew what had happened, what he had tried to do. Charlie Valentine loved her, and now, being honest with himself, Ruby Brennan realized she loved him as well. She supposed that she always had, though she wanted more than a song. She got it. Charlie gave up what was seemingly prized most about his character, and was now alone to face the wrath of the processors. Ruby realized what she wanted, realized it when she looked upon her parents' mangled forms, holding each other close, sobbing over their daughter. No more. The burden would no longer be theirs. She'd find Charlie. If they had to share the same fate, so be it. That night, she would head out on her own run-down motorcycle, which was hopefully in decent enough shape to catch up with Charlie, and by some miracle, it had been. Wet Charlie flicked away the butt of his cigarette, which created a ripple where it fell. As the effect grew in size, there came a rumbling beneath. Dry Charlie was shivering violently as the water began to lap at his legs. So cold. He never thought he could be so cold. In response, his doppelganger began to chuckle a little, slapping Dry Charlie's arm hard like Caesar used to. So that leads us to this point, my friend. You are Ruby's little something in this world of nothing. I'm anxious to see how the two of you fare. Really, I do. Dry Charlie felt himself fall to his knees, the cold water splashing up onto his body, chilling him even more. Only one more thing I wanted to tell you before I go, Wet Charlie said, looking down at Dry Charlie. Only now he wasn't Charlie at all. He was Caesar. He was Ruby. Now his mother and father. He had no form anymore, just a light that Charlie could no longer bear to look at. Nor could he tell if it was the voice of the speaker or if it was the cold water engulfing him. Endure. Charlie woke with a scream as hands grabbed at him, forcing him down onto a cold table. He's alive, Marlowe. This guy's alive. The room was a sweltering vessel, and its rhythmic pulsations defeated Ruby to all conscious thought. She lay in a fetal position in the corner farthest from the door, her wide eyes fixed on it, awaiting her promised visitor. Charlie was dead. His body would be processed. As she lay here, buffeted by a wall and floor and unable to rest, she tried to imagine what they might make from the man she had loved. Perhaps his bones and muscles would make up the main components of a piano. That would be fitting. His skin made into paper to write songs on. Cigars from his fingers, perhaps. Maybe his other foot would make another gun. It had worked well the first time, despite Marlowe's sabotage. So many assurances the weapons dealer gave as he and his crew loaded them into the van after finding them beside the wreckage. Looking back at it now, she could see their desperation to make amends for their contribution to her and Charlie's crimes. Their fake smiles oblivious as she shuddered in the rain as Charlie lay oblivious to the world. She wished she could have kept him alive. Just a few more minutes to look into his eyes, to tell him that she loved him. When Marlowe's boys started to reach for them, she clung to him tightly, refusing to be separated from him, like she was from... The shifting air now became even more unbearable as the smoker molded himself from the wall. His suit was covered by the freshly disgusted wetness of the muscles, seeping moisture. He grinned at Ruby as he pulled a cigar from his coat pocket. Ruby held herself tightly as the hopelessness took hold, and he lit up. Well, sweetheart, was it worth it? All in vain. Everything. The vision of Charlie being carried away, only to have Marlowe later regretfully tell her that he had succumbed to his wounds. When she insisted on seeing the body, Marlowe had his men seize hold of her and bring her to this ever-beating tumor that was her cell. There were things that she saw when she was being drugged through the warehouse, things that Marlowe procured at the base of his operations. A walkway that arched above a mess of teeth, hair, and ever-bleeding flesh, tendrils reaching out of cylinders full of precious blood. In return, men in safety gear were allowed small pieces of the cancer that would separate from the mass by handfuls. Yep, that's the source of it, Ruby. It's where we come from. It's what all of you are being fed to. Your plasma at least, but in your case, baby, I think we're gonna make an exception. The smoker approached her with Caesar's mock pity. his squelching steps unhalted despite the floor's refusal for stillness. When he was before her, he squatted down to force eye contact while taking a dreaded inhale from the cigar. Ruby's eyes filled with tears as she tried to brace herself against the fumes. He blew a cloud, black as her eyes, then lightening to a dull gray, then to white. When it cleared, Ruby was no longer looking into the face of her old lover, but upon a valley of charred black stones. Numberless beasts, goats, bulls, cattle, pigeons, doves, ravens, all strewn about, cut open with their life's blood, slowly forming an ocean which filled the valley, a cacophony rising as people plunged themselves into the crimson water to drown. Above the calamity, the sky remained dark, cloud-like smoke billowing from a great furnace. Ruby turned around to see herself amongst the multitude of pure human forms, all whole and unmolested. Yet they all wept in bemoaning agony. Ruby began to tremble at their misery, for she knew it must be founded in truth that pertained to her as well. A sharp chill ran through her as men and women passed by her to join the rest of those who perished in the valley of blood. Old and young, beautiful and ugly, solitary or holding hands in groups of families, dragging their children along with no concern for their distress. The clouds remained dark, and Ruby felt hopeless. Hopeless as all these people. A compulsion was building up inside her to turn towards the crowd. What other choice was there? What did it matter if she carried on? Charlie was dead. Caesar too. Her parents would likely be killed for her transgressions as well. The world was a creation of malign intent, and humanity's purpose was to simply fuel it with its demise. Suddenly there was a voice, powerful and in tune to an ancient melody of a forever lost land. The throng of hopeless souls halted their willful demise and headed to the speaker, to whom Ruby now beheld. Whether the naked form was a male or female, Ruby could not tell. She only knew that it was beautiful, and that the deepest lust began to burn within her. To experience the flesh of this being in whatever way possible was the purest physical sense that she would strive for. It was the only thing that mattered. When it spoke again, she began to feel the crowd move towards the voice, pushing her forward as well. The excitement of getting close to this being, of touching those close to her, the joys of flesh, sin unfactored. She heard herself laughing, weeping, moaning. All was not lost. Pleasure still remained, so life remained. What more did they need? What human being needs a God who abandons them, tells them that they are unworthy of salvation, that they are only worth their own flesh and blood? The being understood all too well these feelings, and there was only one outcome: supplication and devotion to the endless pleasures of the flesh. The crowd began to merge together in an ecstasy of endless sensual experience. Nothing was forbidden, not anymore. There was no one to judge. Ruby was about to join in when a shudder passed through her heart, a burning sensation that kept her still while the degradation occurred around her. Her lustful feelings were still present, but this burning was too much to override. The being was speaking, singing while its servants obeyed vigilantly, until it suddenly caught sight of Ruby's stillness. It began to approach her, its beautiful limbs shimmering even in the blackened overcast. The lust had become unbearable, yet the flame in her heart kept her from acting upon it. However, when it was before her, Ruby realized she was in the presence of a hairless mass of pitiful proportions. This was neither male or female, neither was it human. It was a void mockery of power, a loud voice and an illusion of beauty. The lust was completely left, and the burning had become a comfortable warmth. "Will you not partake in my joy?" the thing asked Ruby. Its voice was pathetically weak and frail. The fact that it had such an impact previously was farcical to her. She looked around to find that the sights of fleshly pleasure that herself wanted to accept now disgusted her. By this point, the violence had begun. The entrails were being passed around amongst the orgies, and the stench of emptied bowels made Ruby want to vomit. The thing's face had become a childish grimace, and all at once, Ruby Brennan came to the realization that the reality she had been living in was formed in the image of this outcast, whose glory was a shameless imitation of the one who had given its power long before. It led people to prosperity, as long as they were fit to defile themselves, to act against their own nature. Life progressed and technology increased, allowing for new ways to experience methods of fleshly excess. Centuries upon centuries of a base obsession, to the point where the entire aspect of the human form became the lead source of architecture and currency. Ruby also saw the mound of tumorous amalgamations of hair and teeth and eyes. The latchers and the renders were merely the underlings that were condemned alongside this thing, who basically took possession of the abominable cancerous masses fueled by human plasma. Caesar died because of this thing. Ruby's mother and father gave up their bodies to keep it as far away from her as possible. Marlowe made a faulty firearm for Charlie on behalf of this cancer. The smoke cleared as the door opened. Marlowe stepped inside, void of any facade or courtesy. He and two of his men approached Ruby, pulling her violently to her feet. A question was running through her mind. "They want you, Ruby," said Marlowe with a sneer. Why did Charlie's foot work? All of you. She was led out into the walkway, where she could see the mass below. The workers were no longer feeding blood to it. Ruby knew what was in store for her, and now she knew who was behind all of it, she supposed. But why had she made it this far? What encouraged her to leave home and find Charlie? To not deliver him up to the renders to save herself? To love Charlie? To love it all? If there was no hope, as was presented by the smoker, why was the burning comfort still in her heart? They began to go down the stairs. Ruby could already see the tendrils reaching for her, but she was calm. "Marlowe!" A scream was heard in the distance as a man came running to the guardrail of the platform. Ruby felt her bottom lip begin to quiver strangely. "Marlowe! This guy's alive!" A jolt hit Ruby's body. The burning filled her chest as she halted her steps, causing the two men to reach for her arms and violently try to move her along. They couldn't. Then, without any effort it seemed, Ruby pulled herself free from the man on her right and grabbed the man on the left's pistol from his holster. They were dead before Marlowe could completely turn around. Ruby fired into the deceiver's throat, then shoved him into the mound, a choking gurgle of agony, more satisfying than a scream could ever be. Shouts filled the warehouse, followed by gunfire. A quickening sent her to each audible source, and blood followed. Screams, hopelessness, remorse. They wanted the pleasure to continue on for at least one more day. No living being would be more than enough to grant them a few fleeting seconds of agony. What followed after was not allowed to enter into Ruby's mind. She heard the lullaby of her mother, a love song from Charlie in her honor, and another faint sound that still seemed to drown out the rest. It was an immaculate glorification that had been sung behind the dark clouds since before the mockery came. A true beauty that had all made it possible to ignore and spread no more acknowledgement of its existence. And Ruby believed now that a remnant had indeed been found. She was part of it, and nothing could stand between her and the love she now felt for a face unseen. Her eyes turned to the abomination. Forms were beginning to merge from it. They were devils, the nightmares that she had feared all her life pitifully stretched and elongated themselves towards her, not to harm her, but to plead. The burning comfort and joy seemed to overtake her completely. She felt something in her hand, then the scent of gasoline, and the wretched screaming of the abominations denied their physical form. When Ruby came back to herself, she was standing over the broken form of Charlie Valentine. A word came to her, in a whisper that insinuated a future of uncertainty on their part, but for the speaker, all was clear upon him. So many in this world would deny his presence, while most would remain willfully ignorant. Ruby and Charlie themselves may have moments of doubt ahead, and the others, set aside for his intended purposes, would find their own road hard. But a summation was given in a single command: endure.